Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Spagnoletti, Chief Executive Officer of the DC Bar, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar to discuss a topic of paramount importance to all of us who work in the legal community. Last year, a first-of-its-kind research study was fielded with the goal of uncovering personal and workplace risk factors for mental health and substance use problems among practicing attorneys. The results are in, and they are truly eye-opening. We'll be hearing about that survey during today's presentation, which is titled Stress, Drink, Leave, an examination of gender-specific risk factors for mental health problems and attrition among licensed attorneys. Today's session is the culmination of over a year of close collaboration between the study's co-authors, Patrick Krill and Justin Anker, and the DC Bar and the California Lawyers Association. We are so proud to have participated in this critical research, which will be published in the journal PLOS One on May 12th. And we're very hopeful that the data and insights shared today will help drive enhanced awareness and mitigation of the mental health and gender disparity issues disproportionately affecting the legal profession. So, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce the study's co-authors and today's presenters, Patrick Krill and Justin Anker. Patrick is a globally recognized leading authority on addiction, mental health, and well-being in the legal profession. He's authored more than 70 articles related to addiction and mental health, including a frequent advice column for law.com and regular contributions to CNN.com and other national media outlets. Patrick is the principal and founder at Krill Strategies and the former director of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation's Legal Professionals Program, a preeminent clinical treatment program for addicted attorneys, judges, and law students. Dr. Anker is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Minnesota. His current work focuses on the development and testing of translational models that combine preclinical methods of assessing biological stress system function with clinical substance use disorders treatment methods. Dr. Anker's work has been published in over 40 journals, and he has presented at over 80 conferences nationally and internationally. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Krill and Dr. Anker to the virtual podium for an illuminating presentation of their research.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. And I'd also like to thank all of you who have made the time to join Justin Anker and myself for this really important discussion today, highlighting some forthcoming research on lawyer mental health and attrition. So before I go any further, I'll just note that here we are in April, which is Alcohol Awareness Month, and that's sandwiched in between March and May, March being Women's History Month, and May being Mental Health Awareness Month. So really the timing of this event couldn't be more fortuitous, and we're really glad that you're here and hopeful that you'll take some useful information away from today's discussion. And actually, I'm quite confident that you will. As Bob mentioned in his introduction, the title of our paper, and therefore the title of today's presentation, is Stress, Drink, Leave, Gender-Specific Risk Factors for Mental Health and Attrition in the Legal Profession. So let's go ahead and get started. I don't need to go into a lot more detail about my background beyond what Bob shared. I'm an attorney, licensed alcohol and drug counselor, and I now work as an advisor to large law firms and corporate legal departments in the realm of mental health and personal well-being. I'm also obviously a researcher, and I'm glad to be here today sharing some of the research that I've been conducting recently with my colleague, Justin Anker. I'll say a few words about Justin. He's someone that I've known for close to a decade now. We've had the opportunity to work together in a variety of contexts, including our time working together at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. And Justin really knows his stuff when it comes to stress, substance use, and specifically the interplay between stress and substance use and substance misuse, which is a big piece of our focus in this research generally. So I'm really glad that he was willing to join me in this research project, and I'm quite proud of the work that we've done. And as you'll see, there's a lot more on the horizon beyond simply what we're going to be presenting for you today. So I don't want to go any further without thanking the California Lawyers Association and the DC Bar two organizations that have been absolutely fantastic to work with. Dating back to 2019, when I first approached both organizations and proposed this research, they've just been a delight to work with, truly professional people, and they're invested in this work, and they really are concerned about some of these challenges that we're facing in the legal profession, and they're wanting to help us to do this work to really uncover some of the risk factors and to hopefully better inform the conversation so that we can make some important and overdue progress in the legal profession. So again, my thanks to the leadership and staff of both the CLA and the DC Bar. You're fantastic, and we really do enjoy working with you, and we appreciate your leadership on this vitally important subject matter. So let me tell you a little bit about this project. Obviously, this, as I mentioned, is going to be the first of several papers that we are going to be publishing. And for anyone who's listening to today's presentation who may have actually participated in this survey, let me just say thank you, because we recognize it was a lengthy survey, but that actually gave us the ability to capture a lot of really meaningful and important information. We ended up with a large random sample of licensed attorneys who are members of the California Lawyers Association or the DC Bar. The data is about 9 months old at this point. We collected it last summer. And this is Stress Drink Leave is one of the first of multiple papers. I'll speak at the end of the presentation about the additional things that we're going to be looking at in subsequent papers, but this is the first of several papers going through the peer review process on its way to publication. And sort of the headline that we found with this work was that there are significant gender disparities related to not only mental health, but substance misuse, specifically alcohol use, and also attrition. And we uncovered some of the important information as it relates to the prevalence of the problems, but also what's driving the problems for both men and women in the legal profession. So that's the headline. 1 in 4 female attorneys are currently contemplating leaving the profession specifically due to mental health, stress, or burnout. That was the way we phrased the question. Are you considering leaving the legal profession due to mental health, stress, or burnout? And that number was 1 in 4 for licensed attorneys who are female. And it was less than that, but still a really troubling percentage, 17% for male attorneys. We do expect that that finding in and of itself will be a bit of a wake-up call and hopefully really inform the dialogue and drive us towards some creative solutions to try and change that trajectory, to try and change that, to avoid that outcome for so many people who may be very invested in their career, but finding it too stressful, or it's too harmful to their mental health, or otherwise it's sort of burdening them in a way that makes it simply not worth it. So let me talk to you briefly about what we measured. Justin is going to, following my piece here, Justin's going to come on screen and talk to you about the methods and really dive into some of the specific findings. But let me tell you at a high level what we measured for purposes of this paper. I already mentioned that this was a lengthy survey, so we measured many things beyond what you see there on your screen. But here, we looked at depression using the PHQ-9. We looked at anxiety using the G87. We looked at perceived stress, which is essentially how unpredictable and overloaded respondents find their lives. Many of us in the legal profession find our lives unpredictable with uncontrollable levels of stress. We measured alcohol use, and we specifically chose an instrument that I used in a previous research project. You may have noted on my sort of bio slide there, it said that I led a large research project, a study that was published in 2016, the ABA Hazel and Betty Ford study. And that has been quite informative. And it's also been, I would say, quite persuasive for the profession about the need to become more serious around mental health and well-being. But looking at alcohol use specifically, we used an instrument called the Audit C. We wanted to use the same instrument here so that we could compare findings. We also looked at workplace permissiveness towards alcohol, again, getting at what drives these problems. I don't need to tell anyone who's dialed into today's presentation that alcohol and the legal profession sort of go hand in hand, and they have for a long time. There's a significant cultural embrace of heavy drinking, or at least regular drinking in the legal profession. And we wanted to ferret out the impact of that on some of the items that we were measuring. We knew it was important to look at work-family conflict. As I mentioned, we asked about leaving the profession specifically due to mental health, burnout, or stress. We also wanted to measure effort, reward, and balance, right? Are you needing to put more work in to get the same level of reward as someone else potentially? Work over commitment. Lawyers are no strangers to long hours. And we also wanted to look at perceived possibility of promotion. So these are some of the items that were included in that survey and that we focused on for this first paper. Why? Why is it important to identify the predictors of mental health problems in the legal profession? Well, I've already alluded to this. This is implicit in the remarks that I've offered so far, but we really need to go beyond prevalence data, and we need to understand why lawyers succumb to these challenges at levels that are significantly higher than other populations. The stress drink leave problem, what we already know, I mentioned that 2016 study, but it showed roughly 28% of lawyers were experiencing symptoms of depression. Roughly 23% were experiencing maladaptive stress, and depending on how you measured it, between 21 and 36% were engaged in problem drinking. We also know that attrition in the legal profession among women has been a longstanding problem. You read about this all the time. Efforts of employers or other stakeholders in the legal profession to try and attract and retain female attorneys. And it is not hard to understand based on the data that we're going to share with you today, or much of the data that's already been out there, that sometimes the legal profession is simply inhospitable terrain for female attorneys, and we really need to do better, and we really need to take a structured and thoughtful approach to changing that dynamic. I'll also say it was vitally important to get at some of the drivers of these problems, because when they go unaddressed, the toll is so significant. Right? We know that there can be a significant human toll. I don't need to recount any of the headlines that we've all seen over the last several years, or personal stories. If you've been in the profession long enough, you know someone who has struggled with substance use or mental health problems. Perhaps you have. You probably know people who have chosen to leave the profession as a result. So the human toll, which is ultimately at the end of the day what I'm the most concerned about, and I would imagine most people invested in this work are most concerned about. But the toll doesn't stop there. There's a threat to the work environment, culture and morale within a legal employment environment, obviously the reputation of an employer, the impact on the clients, right? We don't even need to go into a separate discussion about protecting the public and trying to make sure that clients aren't negatively impacted by the mental health and well-being or lack thereof of their attorney. But that's a real consideration and something that we specifically speak to in the manuscript that'll be published on May 12th. We also know that productivity can be threatened, and obviously there can be a financial impact as well when these challenges go unaddressed. So we have to go upstream. I really love this quote from Desmond Tutu. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they are falling in, which is why we did this work, why I thought it was so important to take a different approach to examining mental health and addiction in the legal profession to really get at root causes so that, again, hopefully we can begin to address them. We also need new data to inform the conversation. There's a lot happening in the legal profession to improve mental health and well-being. It really all did kick off with that 2016 study, the ABA Hazelwood and Betty Ford study. There was also a study published that year on law student mental health. And together, the data that was reported in those two studies were the impetus for the formation of a national task force, the National Task Force on Lawyer Wellbeing, which just recently transformed into the Institute for Wellbeing and Law. Some of you may have seen some coverage of that yesterday. It's a really exciting development. I'm on the board of that organization, and we're looking forward to doing great work in the years ahead. But point being, there's a lot happening in the legal profession to try and change the mental health landscape, but we don't have a lot of great new data. So that's another reason why this work was so important. Roughly 33 states, since the National Task Force issued its report, roughly 33 states, I believe is the current count, have developed their own statewide task forces or commissions. We'd love to be able to share this data with them and look forward to it. And again, why we're so appreciative to the CLA and DC Bar for wanting to take a leadership role here to provide this data to the legal profession. There's also the ABA Wellbeing Pledge targeting legal employers specifically. And we need information, we need data, we need to be able to give good advice to employers how they can begin to make improvements or to build upon improvements that they may have already been making in relation to mental health and well-being. This pledge campaign, I have to tout it every opportunity that I can. It's a concept that I first developed back in 2014, but it wasn't really ready to come to light. I proposed it again in 2018, and the ABA took this idea up. We've run with it, and there are now more than 200 employers who have taken the pledge and begun to implement this framework to try and affect change within their employment organization, within their workforce. And I really do believe this has led to significant progress so far. And again, having additional data, new data that'll shed important light on some of these risk factors will help all of these stakeholders who are so very invested in trying to change the narrative around mental health and well-being. There's also the issue of stigma. We don't dive into that too much in this paper, but we know that stigma surrounds mental health and addiction in the legal profession, in society as a whole. And the best way to counteract stigma is often through facts, through data, through science. And so our hope was to continue to make the improvements that have already been underway around stigma, and this anti-stigma campaign really take on new life and be re-energized moving forward. So our objective with this first paper was to identify predictors of the stress, drink, leave problem, maladaptive work-related behaviors, right, that contribute to this, but also factors that contribute to the mental health disparity. In that 2016 study, we noted that women and men were not similarly situated as it relates to depression, anxiety, and alcohol use. We also know, as I've said, that there's a gender gap when it comes to attrition and possibility of promotion and all of those things. So this is what we were trying to explore with some level of precision in this study. Those maladaptive practices include work over commitment. We're not suggesting that the legal profession should suddenly be full of people who aren't working hard. That's never going to happen, nor should it. Our clients depend on us to work very hard, to deliver results, and to be effective in our roles. But you can work too much. And I might be breaking news for some people on this call, but there is such a thing as work over commitment and working too much because of the impacts that can have on our physical health, but also our cognitive health, which can then undermine the work product that we're delivering to those clients. As I mentioned, workplace permissiveness towards alcohol, work-family conflict, and the promotion sort of glass ceiling problem that has been part of the legal profession for a long time. We're making strides in this regard as well, but we have a long way to go. I just saw an article a couple of days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, that Sidley Austin recently promoted a female attorney to the leadership of the firm, the first female attorney in the firm's 155-year history. And I know her, she's a fantastic attorney, and she's going to make a great leader of that organization. That's emblematic of the type of progress we're starting to see with women taking the reins at organizations. But again, we still have a long way to go in order to try and balance those scales somewhat. These issues have not been systematically, I was going to say systemically, but they have not been systematically investigated, right? We all have observations. We have mountains of anecdotal evidence. And there are things that I could share with you just off the top of my head that would really illustrate the nature of these challenges, but we needed reliable, empirical evidence. We needed to apply some level of scientific rigor and scrutiny to this discussion, which is what we were setting out to do here, to systematically investigate these things, capture data, look for relationships, and uncover, hopefully, a path forward so that we'll be able to make some progress. I'd like to invite my co-author, Justin Anker, on screen at this point to talk to you specifically about the methods and some of the results that we uncovered and that will be published again on May 12th in the journal PLOS One. That's PLOS-1. It stands for the Public Library of Science One. So Justin, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'll come back following your presentation.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for attending. I'm going to go into a little bit more of the details in terms of the study that we did. So our recruitment was coordinated in collaboration with the CLE and the DC bar, and advertised in newsletters by both organizations to their listserv members. And participants were randomly selected to receive an email containing a link to the survey. Now, the random sampling is a key piece to this study. It's an important feature that sets it apart from other studies that have been done on examining mental health in the legal profession. So one of the things that random selection does is that it ensures that the results obtained from the sample are approximate to the entire population what that sample is taken from. And it eliminates the potential bias by giving all individuals an equal chance of being selected. The final sample for our study consisted of 2,863 participants with current employment in the legal profession. So going over a little bit about the makeup of the sample in terms of demographics, women made up approximately 51% of the sample, and women tended to be a bit younger compared to men. So 65% of women were 50 or younger, compared to 49% of men who were 50 or younger. Women were also significantly less likely to be married, 75.3 versus 58.3 for men, were more likely to be divorced or never married, and were less likely to have children compared to men. And approximately 67% of women and men reported working over 40 hours in a typical work week. And this hits on some of the things that Patrick was mentioning in terms of overwork. And finally, a significantly greater proportion of men were in senior positions compared to women. So for example, managing partner or senior partner. So going over a little bit of the data in terms of the mental health assessments that we looked at, we assessed the prevalence and severity of depression and anxiety symptoms using the PHQ-9 and GAD-7, as Patrick mentioned. Well, these instruments, especially the PHQ-9, are routinely given in patients or doctors, to patients in doctors' offices. So many of you probably have been given the PHQ-9 actually. And scores for this instrument range from minimal, mild, moderate, or severe. And scores in the mild range suggest that potential problems with depression or anxiety are present and that they should be monitored, and lifestyle changes are often recommended to remedy them. Results of our study from our sample indicated that 30% of the legal professionals had mild symptoms of depression or anxiety. And these rates were significantly higher among women compared to men, which is what we've seen in previous studies. Approximately 35% of women had mild depression or anxiety compared to approximately 25% of men. So there were those gender differences. Scores in the moderate to severe range for both of these instruments can be a cause for concern, and treatments often recommended. 19% of our sample had moderate to severe symptoms of depression or anxiety. And again, these rates were significantly higher among women. To put these results into a little bit more perspective, it helps to compare them to rates in the general population. So here we see that rates of moderate to severe depression and anxiety in the general population are overlaid over our results from the legal profession. Rates were at least twice as high in the legal profession compared to the general population. And the difference is greatest with respect to anxiety. So 8% of women in the general population had moderate to severe anxiety compared to 23% of women in the legal profession. And 4% in the general population of men had moderate to severe anxiety compared to 15% of men in the legal profession. So next, we'll get into assessing how we assess the stress drink problem directly by using 3 measures. And I'll start by introducing the measure that we had and then go into the results from that measure from our sample that we took. So let's start with stress. Stress is an inevitable part of day-to-day life, and it can be a healthy part of it. Helps us get up in the morning, helps us motivate us to do work, to get the things done that we need to day to day. However, its duration and frequency can have significant implications for overall health and well-being. This is where a lot of my research centers on. To assess stress, we use the perceived stress scale, which measures how unpredictable, uncontrollable, and overloaded someone finds their life. Research has shown that scores in the moderate to severe range are associated with depression, anxiety, and pose a high to very high health concern. So despite the fact that the classification of it being moderate, it's not innocuous. It can be potentially, it could be a potential health concern associated with anxiety and depression. So going into the results from our survey, 58% of the sample had moderate to severe stress. And looking at gender differences, significantly more women had moderate stress compared to men. So for example, 67% of men had moderate to severe stress compared to 49%. While turning to drinking, to assess problematic alcohol use in the form of risky or hazardous drinking, we used the assessment called the Alcohol Use Disorder Identification Test, or the audit. The audit is a well-validated instrument that has been used to assess the frequency of drinking in several high-stress occupations. So it was a go-to for our study looking at drinking within the legal profession. Now, just going over how many people indicated that they were current drinkers, over 80% of attorneys indicated that they were a current drinker. This is 10% higher than 70% that is in the general population. So drinking, whether it is problematic or not, is more common among lawyers compared to the general population. Over half of the lawyers screened positive for risky drinking on the audit, and 30% screened for high-risk hazardous drinking. And this high-risk hazardous drinking is a concern because it's interpreted to be within the range of alcohol use or possible alcohol dependence. Now, looking at the gender differences, a significantly greater proportion of women compared to men engaged in risky drinking, 60% versus 46% for men, and then 34% of women engaged in high-risk hazardous drinking compared to 25% of men. Now, going into the third facet of that stress drink problem, leave problem, leaving. So we included a survey item, which was an important item, which asked, are you considering or have you left the legal profession due to mental health problems, burnout, or stress? Participants responded yes or no. So looking at the results, the legal professionals who endorsed contemplating leaving the profession due to stress, burnout, or mental health is shown here. And the proportion of women endorsing this item was significantly higher than that of men. Both of them were high. In fact, 1/4 of all women are considering leaving the profession due to mental health, burnout, or stress. So our next goal was to determine which things in the work environment predict that the stress drink leave problem. And given that women are disproportionately affected by each of these problems, a specific focus was to identify factors that were involved in predicting these problems and comparing men and women on those predictors. And to do this, we used a statistical approach called logistic regression. And I won't go into too much detail, but just give you kind of a surface level idea of what this statistical method does. Logistic regression, in a nutshell, uses math to evaluate the chances of something happening or not happening, or an outcome happening. So it allows us to answer yes or no to questions on whether variables predict an outcome, and provides information on the strength of prediction by providing the likelihood or odds of an outcome given the predictor. Using this approach, you can determine which predictors are more important to an outcome and which are not. Here are predictors 1, 2, and 5 predict the outcome, while predictors 3 and 4 are not as important. We selected, and Patrick went into this, predictors associated with maladaptive workplace practices thought to be common in the legal profession. And the first predictor listed here is work over commitment, which assesses exhaustion, feelings of being overwhelmed by work demands. The second is effort reward imbalance, which assesses the imbalance between effort in meeting job demands and job rewards. And the third predictor listed is alcohol permissiveness at work, which assesses the frequency of alcohol-related work activities in the participant's workplace. Importantly, we selected two other predictors that have been reported in other studies to disproportionately affect women in the legal profession and other professions. Work-family conflict has often been mentioned and measures the degree to which work interfered with family life. And likelihood of promotion was assessed perceived prospects of being promoted. So for the present study, we asked, does work overcommitment, effort reward imbalance, alcohol permissiveness, work-family conflict, likelihood of promotion have an influence on the probability of having moderate to high stress? Do they have an influence on risky drinking? And do they have an influence on leaving the profession due to burnout? And if so, to what extent do these influence these problems? And importantly, do these problems differ between women and men? Since the study occurred, as Patrick mentioned, about 9 months ago, this is during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we wanted to know the extent that COVID influenced these stress, drink, leave outcome measures. And age was also included as a predictor. So we focused on predictors of the stress problem first, and I'll go over those now. Shown here are the predictors of moderate to severe stress, again, an unhealthy level of stress for men and women. The predictors are shown as odds ratios, or the likelihood of the predictor influencing the outcome, which is whether someone experienced the stress or not, or maladaptive stress, we could call it. The predictors are ordered so that those that are most predictive are placed at the top. And as shown, women and men differ in terms of the factors that are most predictive of maladaptive stress. However, work overcommitment was ranked as the #1 predictor for both men and women. And women and men with high overcommitment were approximately 5 times more likely to have maladaptive stress compared to women and men with low work overcommitment. Women and men differed in the second most predictive factor of stress, however. So the second highest predictor of maladaptive stress among women was stress related to COVID. Women who reported an increase in COVID-related stress were 4 times more likely to experience maladaptive stress in terms of general stress, And younger age was the second highest predictor for men. Men who are less than 40 years old were approximately 4 times more likely to experience moderate to severe stress compared to men who are older. So what are the predictors of risky drinking in the legal profession? Men who reported an increase in drinking during COVID were almost 4 times more likely to drink at a level considered risky or excessive. This predictor was significantly stronger among women. Women who reported an increase in drinking during COVID were 7 times more likely to drink excessively. This suggests that COVID was associated with an overall increase in excessive drinking in both men and women, but this effect was significantly more pronounced among women. The second highest ranked predictor was alcohol permissiveness at work, and the degree of prediction was similar between men and women. So specifically, respondents who reported high alcohol permissiveness at their workplace were 1.5 times more likely to drink excessively compared to respondents who reported low alcohol permissiveness. So now we return to predictors of leaving the profession. The workplace-related factor most predictive of contemplating leaving the profession for women was work-family conflict. In fact, women with high work-family conflict were approximately 4.5 times more likely to consider leaving the profession due to mental health, burnout, or stress. Stress was the #1 predictor for men. Men who reported high stress were 4.5 times more likely to contemplate leaving the profession compared to men who reported low stress. And finally, the second highest ranked predictor for women was age. So specifically, younger women are 3.5 times more likely to contemplate leaving the profession due to burnout compared to older women. And compared to men with low promotion scores, those with high prospects of promotion were 2.5 times less likely to contemplate leaving the profession due to mental health, stress, or burnout. And this predictor, importantly, is not present for women. So that concludes my section of the talk. I'm going to turn it back over to Patrick to close us out.
So what I wanted to talk to you now about are some of the key findings, really to just reiterate some of what Justin shared, to really underscore the importance of some of his findings that he reported, but also to share with you some excerpts from the manuscript that will be published on May 12th, because I think that we were able to sort of summarize our view on some of these matters pretty well and pretty succinctly in that manuscript. Clearly, depression, anxiety, and stress are high compared to the general population and other professional populations. Women are experiencing worse mental health than men, but also younger lawyers are experiencing worse mental health. And I want to pause there and just focus on that for a moment, because that was something that we uncovered in the 2016 study as well. We noted that younger attorneys were experiencing higher levels of stress, higher levels of anxiety, and higher levels of problematic drinking. In the intervening years, there have been many efforts targeting that group, that cohort, but our data suggests that we still have a long way to go to improving the mental health landscape, specifically for younger attorneys. It is not uncommon for younger members of any given profession to be experiencing higher levels of stress. Specifically, we looked at, for example, medicine and saw similar trends. But there have been very specific initiatives developed within the medical profession to try and target that younger cohort. And I believe we still have a ways to go there in the legal profession. We also need to increase the role of law schools in trying to tackle this problem and to better prepare lawyers for the job that lie ahead, and to help them develop the tools, but also the awareness and insight that they're going to need to help them navigate the challenges of being a busy practicing lawyer. So I believe there is definitely an increased role for law schools to play moving forward as we try to address some of these findings. As Justin mentioned, and as I've already mentioned, 1 in 4 female attorneys are considering leaving the profession due specifically to mental health, stress, or burnout. The number of female attorneys who may be contemplating leaving the profession for other reasons could certainly be higher than that. And indeed, common sense would suggest that it is. But here we were focused specifically on mental health, stress, and burnout. We noted that women had higher effort, reward, and balance scores, meaning that they needed to put forth greater effort for the same level of reward. They had higher work over commitment scores, higher work-family conflict scores, and higher your workplace scores. Your workplace being the standardized assessment that we used to measure alcohol permissiveness in the workplace. And that asks things like, how frequently do you go drinking with colleagues off the job, et cetera. Men had a higher perceived likelihood of promotion, meaning simply that men saw more opportunity. They thought there was a better chance of them receiving a promotion in the future than women did. The workplace factor most predictive of women leaving the profession, again, due to mental health, stress, or burnout, was work-family conflict. And in fact, female attorneys with high levels of work-family conflict were 4.5 times more likely to be leaving due to mental health. And I think from a prescriptive standpoint, and if anybody listening to this is interested in solutions and how we can make some improvement, that's a clear example. We've got to look for ways to resolve or to mitigate, reduce that tension and that conflict that female attorneys are experiencing between practicing law and enjoying and thriving in their career and having a family, right? It shouldn't be that you have to choose one over the other. And if you try to choose both, you have to give up your career at the end of the day because the stress or the toll on your mental health is too significant or too severe. And so a quote there that you'll see on your screen lifted from the manuscript, I say that a career in the law should not be antagonistic to the full expression of a lawyer's humanity, including their ability to undertake and navigate familial obligations should they so desire. We believe that strategies and interventions aimed at alleviating work-family conflict would be wise pursuits for legal employers hoping to reduce unwanted turnover and increase the likelihood that their attorneys will be able to thrive across all dimensions of their lives, not simply at work, at the firm or whatever the employment environment is, but also in their life as a human being. I think we should, all agree that we want people thriving in their entire life and not simply as a lawyer. For men, the likelihood of contemplating leaving the job was 4.5 times higher for those with high reported stress versus those with intermediate or low stress. I would like to just reiterate a point that Justin made, which I think is so vitally important for us to understand when we're digesting these findings and when you're, in a couple of weeks reading this study or talking about it. Moderate stress, to me at least, sounds not that bad, right? I mean, whose life isn't moderately stressful? Many of us would think that. But if you understand that in the context of what we were actually measuring, perceived stress, and what moderate stress levels have been equated with or shown to be predictive of, we know that moderate stress is not ideal. And in fact, it can precipitate negative mental health outcomes. It can precipitate negative physical health outcomes. And so it's something that we need to be on guard about and looking for ways to mitigate or reduce. Because I believe it was 58% of our overall sample had stress level, perceived stress that was falling within the moderate to severe range. The perceived likelihood of promotion as it relates to attrition specifically, there was a relationship there for men, but not for women. So put another way, men who had a high perceived possibility of promotion were less likely to leave the profession due to mental health burnout or stress. That same thing did not translate to female attorneys. It did not hold true for female attorneys. So again, a quote from the manuscript, it would seem therefore that whatever benefit the perceived possibility of promotion is affording men as it relates to mental health, burnout, or stress is not transferring equally to women. So we were confronted with that finding. We had to sort of opine, what does that possibly mean, to try and interpret that specific result? And we say that one could speculate that women frequently anticipate less opportunity or chance for promotion, thereby rendering that possibility less relevant to their calculation about whether to leave the profession due to mental health. It could also be surmised that, on balance, female attorneys do not view the possibility of promotion as being meaningful or important enough to offset their concerns about mental health and burnout. It is likely that both factors, along with others, could account for this finding. Let's talk for a moment about drinking, because what we found there, on the one hand, it was nothing terribly new. We've understood for decades that lawyers drink at high levels that far outpace the general population and put them at increased risk of alcohol use disorders and a host of problems that come along with excessive alcohol use. But our findings were really unfortunate nonetheless. We can see that despite recent efforts, going back to the pledge, right? I mentioned the pledge campaign. One of the specific planks of the pledge campaign is asking legal employers to de-emphasize alcohol. It's not saying make your work environment dry. It's saying de-emphasize the role of alcohol, make it less, sort of the centerpiece of what you're doing and how your people are socializing. There have been other efforts underway over the course of the last 5 years to try and take alcohol out of the spotlight a bit. It would seem that so far, perhaps those efforts are not yielding much progress or paying great dividends because the levels of high-risk hazardous drinking, which is disordered drinking, that is consistent with an alcohol use disorder, in the old terminology, alcohol abuse or possible dependence. Really high levels of attorneys, roughly a third, are screening positive for that. However, only 2% report ever having received an alcohol use disorder diagnosis. That's a shockingly low number, and it's lower than you would find in the general population in terms of people who have received or sought some sort of help or been treated for an alcohol use disorder. So not only are our levels of drinking higher, our levels of seeking help are much lower. And as we suggest in the manuscript, this disparity suggests an extreme level of underdiagnosis and treatment for a widespread problem, possibly owing to pervasive denial, stigma, and a professional culture that normalizes heavy drinking. Now, I want to spend just a moment on the point that Justin was making towards the end of his remarks about what we found as it relates to COVID and increased alcohol consumption in response to COVID and whether that's problematic. It is my opinion, and that opinion is informed not only by what I'm hearing and lots of anecdotal evidence, but it's clearly informed by our data that many people are going to be at heightened risk for long-term problems in relationship to their alcohol use on the other side of this. Men who were on the other side of this, I mean COVID, right? This sort of unfortunate era that we're all living through. Men who reported an increase in drinking were almost 4 times more likely to engage in risky drinking. Women who reported drinking more in response to COVID were roughly 7 times more likely to be drinking at hazardous levels. Why is that so important? And why does that suggest bad things to come for these people? Well, we know it's well established. This is something that Justin's been researching for a long time. This was clearly implicated in my work at Hazelden Betty Ford when we were treating lawyers struggling with substance use disorders. When people drink in response to stress or negative affect, right, if they turn to drinking as a coping mechanism, that greatly increases the chances or the likelihood of that alcohol use becoming problematic, right? So the reason why you're drinking matters as it relates to your vulnerability, your susceptibility to developing an alcohol use disorder. And it would appear that many lawyers were turning to alcohol as a coping mechanism during COVID-19, which perhaps unbeknownst to them was making them more vulnerable to developing an alcohol use disorder. So it's something we're going to have to be really focused on moving forward. Some concluding thoughts. Hard work and professional rigor have long been associated with the life of the practicing lawyer. There's a point where workloads become untenable, however, threatening to diminish the health and well-being of those tasked with supporting them. Excessive workloads also have the potential to undermine the quality and reliability of the work product delivered in their service, since chronic stress has been consistently associated with lower cognitive function. And anybody on this call who's been under chronic stress or really high stress for a period of time, you probably know you're not thinking all that clearly. And it can have a very tangible and pronounced impact on not only your emotional state, but your cognitive state as well. So we really have to take a look at this. Our findings, again, another quote from the study, raise meaningful concerns about the stress levels of both men and women and the possible impact of that stress on the delivery of effective legal services. Ultimately, when a client hires an attorney or law firm, they expect that the individuals representing them are not experiencing cognitive impairment or diminished executive function due to job burnout. In a profession where work over commitment appears both rampant and significantly predictive of high stress, it would be reasonable to question how consistently those client expectations are being met and whether more safeguards are warranted to facilitate less overcommitment across a variety of legal work environments. So that's something that I want to sort of leave you with as we're wrapping up today to really be thinking about. And of course, all of this is in the manuscript and you'll be able to read it once the study is published. As I mentioned at the top, this was a lengthy survey. And again, I'll reiterate my thanks to anybody who may have participated in the survey, but we captured a lot of data. And what that means is that this paper is only one of several papers that will ultimately emerge from this research project. This was sort of the clearest story that emerged from our data, but there's a lot more to look at and there's a lot more to explore that I believe will be vitally important for the legal profession and will provide welcome information and help us chart a path towards a more sustainable future. The next paper, sort of next up in the hopper, is examining value systems and mental health, the impact of business-focused employer values on employee mental health and well-being. So, we've all probably read or understood that the legal profession has been sort of transforming from a profession into a business. And there's been a lot of scholarship on this point, a lot of law review articles, some research dating back to the 80s. This is not a new observation or phenomenon, but we wanted to really get at the relationship between that transformation into a business and lawyer mental health. We could probably all guess what that's going to look like, but I'm expecting that paper to be quite fascinating as well. We're going to be exploring personality and behavioral factors involved in anxiety, depression, and alcohol use. We're going to be examining racial disparities, and we're also going to be examining the toll of burnout and stress on the physical health of lawyers. So we've talked today about sort of the emotional health, but we haven't really talked a lot about the physical health. And make no mistake about it, excessive stress, depression, anxiety, burnout, excessive substance use. There's a very real physical domain to all of those things as well, which we need to really understand, not only to motivate the profession to take a more aggressive stance towards these issues, but also to help us develop strategies that will ultimately help the people who are perhaps struggling. So that's the extent of what I wanted to cover with you today. We have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to invite Ona Dosumu. Sorry, Ona. I know you well, and I'm still stumbling over your last name. I'd like to invite you on the call now for reactions, questions, and to really wrap the presentation up today. And thank you again for being so willing to partner with us on this vitally important research.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I want to echo my colleague Bob's pride and gratitude in participating in this extraordinary piece of work, and really just thank you and Justin for giving us data. One of the things that really resonated with me is that anyone who has actually been a practicing lawyer, as I have been, anyone who works with lawyers, who's kind of around the profession, right, has all of these anecdotal stories, but actually having this rigorous data that is, statistically significant and subject to real kind of social science rigor is a huge gift, frankly, to those of us who make our living supporting the profession and supporting lawyers. One of the things that jumped out at me when you were talking about the sort of research outcomes in this first study is this issue, and you highlighted it yourself, around a work-family conflict and that driving women from the profession. Again, anecdotally, and even beyond anecdotally, there's a fair amount of data about that in the general population. But I just sort of want to flag for all of the participants, in particular, members of the sponsoring organizations, the National Association of Bar Executives, who are people like me, right, that run bar associations and try to support lawyers in their practice, and the National Council of Bar Presidents. There are policy implications, right, macro national level policy implications in that finding. And I know that it's not your job or Justin's job to take that up, but that is something that we can take up and something that the ABA can take up. The other thing that jumped out at me, and this is one of those pieces of information that isn't new, but I'd love to get your reactions to it, is sort of the higher levels of depression and anxiety in and among lawyers versus the general population. I want to sort of link that up with one of your directions for future study, which is I think it was the second one that sort of talks about personality characteristics. And it really raises this question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? Do a certain type of personality types go into practicing law? Are we, or does law do this to us? So I've asked you a lot of questions, more than you have time to answer in 3 minutes, but I'd love to get your reactions to those things. I'm, again, extraordinarily grateful to both of you. It's a huge service to the to our profession. But why don't I pause there, and then I'll do the final wrap up.
Sure. Well, thank you for the fantastic insights and observations. And I'll address one of those questions because we don't have time to address them all, but the last one, because that is sort of a timeless question. And it's one that I've been grappling with for, the 12 years that I've been doing this work is it the fact that lawyers are predisposed, or is it really the profession? And my view, that is informed by some research into this, that we really do want to explore in much greater detail, is that we as lawyers come to the table with a heightened level of vulnerability, given personality traits, our own value systems, and our tendency to prioritize our career over just about everything. There's a lot that you could generalize, obviously, and I hate to do that, but there's a lot that you could generalize about the lawyer personality. that perhaps predispose them to heightened levels of stress, right? Maladaptive perfectionism is another one. But then there is something in the profession that activates those vulnerabilities and those pre-existing risk factors that are, in my view, probably greater than the general population. But then the stress, the adversarial nature, a lot of the cultural influences within the profession, really just sort of the composite experience of training to become and then becoming a lawyer and practicing as a lawyer, that really can activate and sort of prey upon some of those predispositions. And in my view, that's how we end up with these levels of distress that appear, quite disproportionate to other populations.
Thank you. That's useful. I can't wait to read the subsequent papers and this paper when it comes out on May 12th. I want to wrap up by once again thanking our sponsors, NABI and NCBP, thanking you, Justin, the DC Bar, for partnering with us in this effort, and of course, thanking all of the attendees who participated and gave their time and attention today. Again, huge service and many thanks.